Most people are not particularly well versed in the intricacies of political and moral philosophy, but anyone with even high school debate experience will be familiar with one of the more common and seductive ideologies, utilitarianism. Even those that don't will have heard its summarization: the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It admittedly seems like a fair statement on its face. If good is by definition the most desirable of qualities, then wouldn't it make sense to try and maximize it in society? There are many problems with utilitarianism, but the first and arguably the most fundamental issue is the loose flexibility regarding what constitutes good. Under utilitarianism, it is easy for people to reject their own subjective understanding of the term and thus misunderstand its implications. The reason why this is important is because a form of utilitarianism has become, if not the dominant force, at least a significant force in social and political discourse in the Western world. When it refers to that greatest good, it is referring specifically to the concept of pleasure, or at least an absence and avoidance of suffering. I won't spend too much time substantiating this because it is apparent on every level of society and actively influences the ways in which people interact. From evaluating social programs on the basis of how well they improve so-called quality of life, to policing speech on the basis of being nice, discouraging that which makes people uncomfortable regardless of its possible transformative value. As such, it forms a good-evil dichotomy, with those labels being defined as pleasure and suffering. This is quite at odds with more classical conceptions of good and evil. In particular, I'll be looking at a Christian, Aristotelian, and Buddhist conceptions of good and evil, or at least what it is and is not desirable, as those particular terms are not necessarily applicable to all of those traditions, though I'll make the argument that it still can be applied. There's a surprising amount of correlation between the essential aspects of these systems, even if they deviate significantly from one another in details and implementation. Christianity is probably the concept that most people are readily familiar with, so it'll be the one with which I start. And the first step is identifying what Christianity identifies as its own greater good. This is of course quickly discernible as God, who is seen as the font of all creation and all which is good. More specifically, God does not merely produce good, he is innately and by definition the ultimate good. Everything else can only be defined by its proximal relationship to God, which leads into the next concept of importance: sin. God is the one without sin, a somewhat circular definition once you understand the concept, since sin is essentially separation from God, making the statement that he is without it one of location, that is, he is the metaphysical center of existence. Humans are not without sin. Some of it is an innate characteristic of the mortal condition due to our fall from grace, whereas some of it is generated by actions that are not in accordance with the natural law of God's will. Regardless of its origin, all sin is a stain on the soul which acts to separate one from God. Now, it does not seem possible for a mortal to ever purge himself of sin. The only way to accomplish this is through the concept of salvation, a function of God's grace which is metaphysically the equivalent of union with God. It is possible to keep from adding to one's sin, however, by living virtuously in accordance with the Christian teachings. To summarize, good in the Christian worldview is living in accordance with the will of God and accepting his grace, whereas evil is seen as rejecting his will and thus accumulating sin. Next, let's look at the Aristotelian view on the subject. As before, the starting point is to look at what the ideology considers the ultimate good. For Aristotelianism, this is well defined and is a concept that he calls in the original Greek eudaimonia, which is often translated as something along the lines of human flourishing. Now, it must be pointed out that eudaimonia is not an end state within itself. It is a state of being that describes an ongoing process, namely the continuous pursuit of virtue. While not outright stated by Aristotle, a good way of understanding Aristotelian virtue is to think of them as the heroic virtues: bravery, duty, cunning, piety, and the like. In order to fully understand these concepts, we must also look at the concept of the golden mean. Aristotle described true virtue as the middle ground between two extremes, making pursuit of virtue the process of curtailing excess. For example, bravery is the middle ground between cowardice and recklessness. You can also think of it as the peak of a mountain, where there are many ways to fall from the summit, but to reach the top requires all of these extremes to come together in a unified manner. So to summarize, good in the Aristotelian worldview is a pursuit of virtue through eudaimonia, whereas evil is an abandonment of virtue, which results in a life defined by damaging extremes. Finally, let's look at the Buddhist conception of the world. The end objective of Buddhism is a concept known as nirvana, which I will be translating here as enlightenment for convenience, while fully understanding that it does not fully encapsulate the original term. Probably the best way to summarize this in English would be the psychological concept of ego death, which allows for the cessation of desire. Desire is the fundamental evil of Buddhism because it perpetuates the illusion of a discrete self, and as long as a person is deluded about their own ego, they will continue to use it as a lens with which they interpret and interact with the world, sustaining all of the other material illusions. The way to overcome desire and reach enlightenment varies from one school of thought to another, though there is a commonly agreed upon core set of ideas. This involves embracing the Three Noble Truths, living the Eightfold Path, and practicing the various other ideas transmuted through the sutras. But these can all be summarized as actions that make one more awakened to the reality of the world. This makes understanding, not in the Western intellectual sense, but in a more primordial intuitive sense, the highest good of Buddhism, whereas evil is what distracts from this understanding through delusion. Based on these three systems, a common thread of thought can be recognized in these otherwise unrelated philosophies. All three define good and evil in a certain hierarchical manner, specifically how close one is to some ideal: God, the heroic self, or enlightenment. Good is that which moves an individual higher up on this hierarchy, closer to the ideal, whereas evil distracts from it and leads to a more base state of being. To borrow the English translation of Aristotle's eudaimonia, the good is that which makes man flourish towards the ideal, which means, by contrast, evil degrades humanity away from it. Compare this now to utilitarianism, which rejects this formulation and instead defines good and evil merely as pleasure and suffering. This is in stark contrast to the classical ideologies. First off, pleasure and suffering are topics that the ancient philosophies are almost uniformly agnostic towards. While there could be said to be a general consensus that evil is a sense of degradation ultimately leads to more suffering in a cosmic sense, this should be differentiated from the utilitarian view of suffering and instead be seen as an attempt to express the undesirability of being separated from the ideal. More generally, pleasure and suffering could result from, or predicate, both good and evil, with no direct correlation between the two. Virtue can require self-sacrifice, painful introspection, and challenging self-improvement. And on the flip side, it is no revelation to say that vice can be pleasurable. Secondly, in the classical conception, good and evil are both innate and transient qualities. That is, a person can be good, and actions can be good. Saints, heroes, and bodhisattvas achieve their status through continuous virtue, however their system may define that, which leaves them imbued with a higher metaphysical status than other people. They have not only done good, but are now predisposed to good. In the contradictory context of utilitarianism, good and evil can only be transient because they are relegated to subjective experiences. That is, actions can be good or evil depending on how much pleasure or suffering they create. People cannot be good or evil because pleasure and suffering are not intrinsic characteristics. A pseudo-approximation can be had by trying to measure up the amount of pleasure or suffering a person has caused in their life. But this can only ever be a measure of a person's actions, not their intrinsic value. It is literally measuring utility. All of these characteristics of utilitarianism arise naturally from the analytical materialism of the modern world. The three systems I've analyzed so far are all heavily concerned with metaphysics, arguably more so than the material world. By comparison, a worldview that rejects this in its entirety renders concepts such as flourishing and degradation meaningless, since there is no metaphysical ladder to ascend or descend. If there is nothing more than atoms careening around in space with no greater purpose behind it all, ancient concepts such as good and evil become meaningless and life is reduced to only what can be put on a spreadsheet. I personally reject this conceptualization of the world, which is why I believe that it is so crucially important that people be made aware and cognitive of this use of language. Be specific when using these terms to be clear that they equate to flourishing and degradation, or perhaps the more familiar and closely related concepts of vice and virtue, not merely pleasure and suffering, the pleasant and the unpleasant. This is the major reason the term evil has fallen out of favor, because it innately conveys judgment of a sort which utilitarianism does not believe in. It would rather substitute it for good and bad, for more agreeable terms, given that good is already watered down by its more general usage outside of a purely moral matters. To conclude, language is one of the fiercest battlegrounds when it comes to topics of culture and society. Determining what is good and what is evil is a fundamental requirement before determining proper courses of action, so allowing the terms to be hijacked and thin imitations to replace them cannot be allowed if there is to be any salvaging of culture and society. Fight against moral relativism and think deeply about what leads to a virtuous life. Hello everyone, thank you for watching, and if you liked my work, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share with anyone else you think would be interested in what I have to say. If you didn't like what I had to say, tell me that too. I'm a new content creator, so it will really help my channels grow, even the criticism. If you are watching on YouTube, you might want to consider following me on Rumble, BitChute, or Odyssey as well, just in case I ever upset the powers that be and find my channel gone. Lastly, if you really like what you saw, please consider helping me monetarily. Links to my Patreon and Subscribe Star are below, as well as a PayPal link. Every dollar I get goes right back into my content. Maybe one day I'll even be self-sustaining. Regardless, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.